Something lives inside your chest before the morning even arrives, a quiet pressure that hums beneath everything, telling you that you're behind, that you're unraveling, that something is permanently wrong with the way you're moving through your life. You push through it. You perform normality with a skill that would impress most actors. You tell the people around you that you're fine, and on certain days you almost convince yourself too. But something beneath the surface keeps pulling, something quiet, persistent, like a thread being drawn from fabric that is doing its best to hold itself together. Here is the truth that almost no one will say plainly. The majority of people moving through this world are not actually living. They are reacting to old fear they never examined, choking slowly on anger they never named, drowning in anxiety they have come to accept as simply the texture of modern life. And the way we have been taught to manage all of it, push it down, fight it, project calm while privately disintegrating, may be the very thing making the problem worse. The ancient Stoics understood something we have mostly forgotten. They didn't ask you to escape your emotional life, to perform immunity to difficulty, or to armor yourself against feeling. They asked you to turn directly toward your inner world, to look at it clearly, to strip away the stories your mind constructs, to stop mistaking a thought for a fact. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you hold authority over your own mind, not over the events of the outside world. And yet here we remain, most of humanity spending its finite energy trying to rearrange the external world while leaving the internal one entirely ungoverned. This is not a video that will leave you feeling comfortable. It is a video that will hand you a mirror. Because until you face what has been running your life from the inside, you will continue to outsource your own freedom. If you are ready to stop living as a passenger in your own experience and begin moving with intention, subscribe to Stoic Sight. This is where that work begins. Let's go. Fear rarely makes a dramatic entrance. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar. It seeps into your days like moisture into stone. Invisible at first, then suddenly structural, shaping everything from the inside. It disguises itself as intelligence, as preparation, as being realistic. It wears the language of wisdom so naturally that you don't question it. You simply follow its instructions without realizing you've received any. It tells you to wait before making the call, to hold off on that conversation until the moment feels more appropriate, to let this particular opportunity pass just this once, because the circumstances aren't quite aligned, and the moment does pass, and then the next one, and the one after that. Opportunities don't make announcements when they leave. They simply stop returning. Connections don't shatter dramatically. They drift. Dreams don't die in one visible moment. They collect dust, one avoided risk at a time, while fear continues its steady whisper that this caution is just good judgment. What fear never tells you is the actual terms of the agreement it's offering. It promises safety. What it delivers is a small, controlled, predictable life, and it asks you to call that wisdom. And over time, through long enough exposure, most people do. The avoidance becomes so familiar that it starts to read as identity. I'm not someone who does things like that. I'm just practical. That was never really for me anyway. But those aren't discoveries about yourself. Those are conclusions fear reached on your behalf while you were looking somewhere else. Marcus Aurelius didn't point to death as humanity's deepest fear. He wrote that what a person ought to truly fear is the prospect of arriving at the end of their days without ever having genuinely begun to live them. That is the actual cost, not the embarrassment of failure, not the sting of rejection, not the disappointment of a plan that didn't unfold as intended. All of those are real and temporary. The cost is aliveness, the quality of presence that arrives only when you are actually doing something that stretches you, something that matters to you, something that makes your pulse quicken in the best possible way. Fear hands you the quiet life, the uncomplicated version, and it frames that offer in such measured, responsible language that many people accept it completely without recognizing it as an offer at all. But a quiet life constructed on perpetual avoidance is not peace. It is paralysis dressed in comfortable clothing. Fear doesn't protect you from failure. It protects you from becoming who you were always meant to be. The shift doesn't come from denying that you're afraid. The courage constructed on top of denial is brittle. It fractures the moment it meets genuine pressure. The shift begins in the moment you stop running from the feeling long enough to actually question it. What are you really trying to protect me from? Because if you examine most fear with that quality of honest attention, you'll find it isn't guarding you from genuine danger. It is protecting you from emotional discomfort, from being misunderstood, from looking foolish, from being seen as insufficient, from the possibility of not being chosen, and none of those experiences will actually destroy you. What hollows people out, slowly over years, is the accumulated weight of everything they chose not to attempt. The unreached possibilities, the unspoken things, the version of themselves they caught a brief glimpse of and then slowly turned away from. Fear doesn't mention that part of the agreement. It doesn't explain that protecting your image might cost you your authenticity. It doesn't show you that by running from disappointment, you are producing a slow, private version of it that lives permanently inside you, growing heavier with each passing year. Epictetus taught that a person without dominion over themselves is not free, regardless of how comfortable their external circumstances may appear. Fear, left unexamined, becomes the author of your existence. It writes the script. It draws the boundaries. It determines what you believe is available to you. And the most disorienting thing is that the longer it operates unchallenged, the more natural its version of your life comes to feel. You stop remembering that you made choices that led here. It begins to simply feel like reality. You don't need to eliminate fear. You need to renegotiate your relationship with it. You need to learn to hear its voice without granting it authority over your decisions. Because you are not the fear. You are the awareness that observes the fear. That distinction, that space, is where your genuine agency lives. When you stop treating fear as weakness, when you begin treating it as a signal pointing toward something that still needs healing or something you are meant to move toward, you change its function in your life entirely. Growth will always feel indistinguishable from fear in its earliest moments. That tightening before the honest conversation, that resistance before stepping into the unfamiliar version of yourself, that flutter before the decision that genuinely matters, all of it occupies the same interior territory as fear, because the threshold of growth and the experience of fear share the same address. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It is what happens in the space between feeling the fear and choosing to move anyway. It is the act of continuing when the feeling is loudest. And once you actually face what you've been running from, once you stop long enough to turn toward it, you'll often find it smaller than it appeared from the distance of avoidance. Less permanent, less absolute, and far more often than not, you'll discover the thing you were dreading was never a genuine threat. It was a projection, a mental rehearsal of pain that never materialized. Carl Jung observed that whatever you resist does not weaken, it grows. And that is precisely what happens when you build a life around avoiding your own fears. They do not diminish in the dark, they expand. But the moment you stop fleeing, the moment you bring your full presence to the thing you've been running from, its command over you begins to shrink. That is how freedom begins. Not through a dramatic rupture, but through one quiet act of honesty with yourself. I'm afraid, and I am moving anyway. We were given two options for dealing with anger: explode or suppress. Say the thing you'll spend days wishing you hadn't said, or swallow everything until it corrodes you from within. Most people cycle through these two extremes over the entire course of their lives, never recognizing that both options share the same fundamental flaw. They both treat anger as a problem to be managed rather than a signal to be understood. Anger is not a malfunction, it is a message. It arrives in your body the way physical pain arrives from an injury, to tell you that something has been violated, a boundary that matters was crossed, a value you hold was disregarded, something in you that deserved to be treated with care was not. The problem is that almost nothing in our culture teaches you to listen to it. You are taught to manage it, to suppress it, to apologize for it, to perform composure over the top of it. So the message never gets received, and an emotion that never gets heard doesn't resolve. It transforms. It becomes resentment that shapes how you enter every new relationship before anyone has given you a single reason for suspicion. It becomes bitterness embedded so deeply into your worldview that you mistake it for discernment. It becomes the edge in your tone when speaking with someone who reminds you of someone else entirely, the tightening in your chest when a particular memory surfaces without invitation. We no longer name it anger by then, because by the time it has traveled that far from its origin, it simply feels like how things are. We call it personality instead. We say, I'm not someone who trusts easily, or I tend to keep my guard up. But that isn't identity. That is accumulated, unexamined anger that has quietly claimed territory in who you believe yourself to be. Seneca wrote that anger, when it runs without examination, tends to cause more damage than the original wound that provoked it. Not because anger itself is the problem, but because it is powerful, and anything powerful without understanding becomes a force directed at whatever is nearest. What does a different relationship with anger actually look like in practice? It looks like pausing at the moment of ignition. Not because you are surrendering to what triggered you. Not because your feelings don't matter, but because you have developed the strength to hold the heat without releasing it into the room carelessly. It looks like asking what is actually happening underneath the heat. What part of you is in pain right now? What were you expecting that didn't arrive? What fear is wearing this anger as a protective layer? Because anger, at its most fundamental level, is pain that has learned to defend itself. It is vulnerability that put on armor because staying open once felt too dangerous. The armor works, but it keeps everything at a distance, including genuine connection, including self-knowledge, including the kind of intimacy that makes life feel worth sustaining. Anger is pain that has learned to protect itself, and until you hear what it's protecting, you cannot heal what's underneath. When you stay with your anger long enough to actually hear what it's saying, when you don't rush to discharge it or bury it, something happens. It begins to shift into other things, into clarity about a dynamic that was genuinely unhealthy, into grief about something you actually lost and never properly mourned, into, in certain unexpected moments, a compassion that extends even toward the person who was involved in the trigger. That isn't about excusing harm. It isn't about absorbing mistreatment in silence and calling it spiritual practice. It means you stop allowing the anger to occupy permanent space in your body after it has already communicated what it came to communicate. There is a particular quality of presence in someone who can feel the full weight of a difficult emotion and still choose how they respond. Someone who can be genuinely moved by what happened, not discharge the feeling recklessly, say what actually needs to be said with clarity and without cruelty, and then let the rest go. That is not emotional suppression. That is emotional mastery, and it is not achieved all at once. It is built one moment at a time, in each small pause between the trigger and the response. Carl Jung wrote that what irritates us most in other people frequently serves as a doorway into understanding ourselves. That is the deeper invitation every experience of anger offers, not only to evaluate what happened externally, but to examine what it reveals about what remains unresolved internally. The more honest you are about that inner landscape, the less power anger retains over your decisions. You stop being hijacked by the feeling, you start engaging with it. And from that engagement comes a response that you can actually stand behind, rather than a reaction you spend 3 days reconstructing apologies for. You won't always locate the pause in time. The fire will sometimes move faster than your awareness does. But each time you manage even a partial pause, each time you ask the question instead of making the accusation, you are building the architecture of a genuinely different life. Anxiety doesn't introduce itself. It seeps into your thinking in the language of reason, using words like thoroughness, responsibility, preparation, so that by the time you understand what's happening, it has already made itself comfortable and taken a seat at every decision you need to make. It tells you to review the situation one more time, to run the possible outcomes again, to factor in everything that could go wrong, purely as a precaution. And this sounds almost admirably responsible. It sounds like diligence. What is actually happening is that you are rehearsing pain that hasn't occurred. You are generating the full emotional experience of events that do not exist and may never exist. And your nervous system, which lacks the ability to distinguish between an imagined threat and a real one, responds to all of it as though it is happening right now. The result is exhaustion that arrives without incident, tension with no corresponding event, a persistent low hum of threat with no actual danger in the vicinity. It starts with something small, a task you are uncertain you handled correctly, an ambiguous expression on someone's face, an approaching obligation with unclear parameters, and before you return to where you actually are, your mind has already traveled weeks forward, rehearsing conversations that may never happen, building emotional responses to outcomes that exist entirely in imagination. You are not preparing. You are bracing. And bracing is not the same thing as readiness. Bracing is fear dressed in strategic language, calling itself planning. What anxiety genuinely steals is your presence, not your future, though it redirects your attention there, not your past, though it pulls material from there. What it takes is the experience of now, the actual moment you are inhabiting, the real texture of your day as it is actually unfolding around you. And now is the only location where anything real ever happens. The Stoic insight on this is specific. The vast majority of what we suffer mentally is not real. It is anticipated or imagined or rehearsed or remembered, but it is not occurring now. The degree to which you can return your attention to what is actually present, what is real and immediate and concrete, is the degree to which you reclaim the lived experience of being alive. You don't need to resolve every anxious thought to move forward. You don't need to dismantle each worried scenario through argument or prove it false through logic. You simply need to come back to the breath, to the body, to the specific thing directly in front of you. That isn't avoidance. That is anchoring. There is a profound difference. Aristotle named courage as the foundational virtue, the one that makes all the others possible. Courage in the context of anxiety is showing up for your actual life even while your nervous system insists you should stay hidden. It is choosing to act in the direction of what genuinely matters to you while carrying the uncertainty, rather than waiting for the uncertainty to resolve first, because it won't resolve in advance. The anxious mind will always produce another scenario, another variable that hasn't been accounted for, another risk it wants to protect you from. If you wait for certainty before you move, you will be waiting forever. What builds genuine peace is not solving every question in advance. It is discovering, through the actual experience of living, that you can handle what arrives, that the conversations you feared didn't end you, that the rejection didn't destroy you, that you walked through the failure, the loss, the disappointment, and you are still here, still capable, still moving forward. That self-trust isn't constructed through thinking, it's built through accumulation, through the track record your nervous system slowly begins to believe when you stop letting anxiety veto your decisions. The practice isn't to defeat anxiety, it is to stop handing it authority, to hear its voice without granting it final say over your choices, to feel the worry and then choose your response from somewhere deeper, somewhere more grounded, somewhere closer to who you actually are underneath the noise. Return to the present, again and again. That is not a minor discipline. That is the practice of reclaiming your own life. You are not your emotions. That sentence sounds almost deceptively simple, but it may contain more genuine transformative power than any other understanding available to a human being. Because inside shame, you feel like you are the shame itself. Caught inside fear, you feel like fear is your nature, something structural and permanent about who you are. In the heat of anger, the emotion doesn't feel like weather passing through. It feels like the material you're made of. And this confusion is the source of an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering. We have been handed a world that grades our emotional experiences. Happiness is acceptable. Sadness is a problem requiring correction. Calm is success. Anxiety is weakness. And so we have learned to approach our emotional lives as performance reviews, evaluating ourselves by what we feel, frantically trying to manufacture the approved version and suppress the rest. But emotions are not assessments of character. They are not verdicts delivered on your worth or your competence. They are information moving through a body and mind that are doing precisely what they were designed to do, responding to experience, signaling what matters, pointing toward what hasn't been resolved. Shame arrives after a mistake and declares that you are the mistake, but you are not the mistake. You are the person who made one, who can learn from it, who has the full capacity to choose differently from here. Fear arrives before a risk and insists you are not capable of handling what waits on the other side. But you are not the fear. You are the one hearing it. And there is a space between you and the fear, and inside that space is where all genuine choice lives. Anger arrives after a violation and presents itself as your entire response. But you are not the reaction. You are the person with the capacity to decide what to do with the energy before it becomes action in the world. The Stoic tradition didn't ask you to become numb or unreachable. It asked you to become the sky, vast and coherent enough to hold all kinds of weather without being defined by any particular storm. The clouds are not the sky. The rain is not the sky. And your emotions, however intense and real, are not you. This shift in your relationship with your own emotional life changes the entire experience of being alive. When you believe you are your emotions, every difficult feeling becomes a threat to your identity. Every wave of sadness is evidence about who you fundamentally are. Every eruption of anger is confirmation of your core character. Every moment of fear is proof of your inadequacy. But when you recognize that you are the awareness observing those emotions, when you step slightly back and witness rather than fully inhabit without any distance, you create room to choose, to ask, what does this feeling need from me right now? What is it actually pointing toward? What response would I be genuinely proud of making? This is not detachment. You are not being invited to stop caring or to create glass between yourself and your experience. You are being invited to engage completely, while remaining rooted enough that no single emotional weather pattern sweeps you entirely off course. The person who has developed this quality moves differently in the world. They can be deeply moved without being destabilized. They can feel the full weight of what happened and still choose how to carry it. They can sit inside genuine difficulty without urgently needing it to end before they can function again. And they can extend that quality of steady presence to the people around them because they are not perpetually managing their own internal emergencies. This is what the Stoics called inner freedom, not the freedom of a life without loss or difficulty or frustration, the freedom of a self that remains coherent regardless of what conditions arrive, a self that experiences everything and is defined by none of it. You are not broken for feeling what you feel. Every emotion moving through you is evidence of a living person, with things that matter to them, people they love, a past that shaped them, and a future that calls them forward. None of that is failure. All of it is the experience of being fully alive. The question is not how to stop feeling. The question is how to feel everything without becoming a casualty of it. There is an illusion so thoroughly embedded in how most people navigate their lives that the majority never recognize it as an illusion at all. It is the belief that control over external events is the actual source of internal stability. That if you can manage enough variables, predict enough outcomes, influence enough people's responses, you will finally arrive at the peace you've been trying to locate, but you cannot control most of it. Not how others choose to perceive you, not the decisions they make, not the timing of events, not the circumstances that move through your days, with complete indifference to your plans and preferences, and the energy spent in that pursuit, the strategizing, the worrying, the low-grade vigilance, the constant management was energy directed at outcomes that were never actually yours to determine. The Stoics navigated conditions that make most contemporary difficulties look manageable. Wars, plagues moving through entire populations without discrimination. The collapse of empires they had known their entire lives. And they developed a framework for moving through all of it, not by achieving greater control, but by locating the single thing that remained entirely in their hands, regardless of what the external world decided to do. That thing was response, how they met what came, the quality of their engagement with circumstances they didn't choose, what they decided to do with what they were given, even when what they were given was severe. That was the only domain that truly belonged to them. And it is, in truth, the only domain that has ever belonged to any of us. What someone else says about you is not yours to govern. How they interpret your actions or your intentions, not yours. Whether they recognize your value, meet you with the fairness you've earned, or respond to your effort with the acknowledgement it deserves, not yours. But what you do with those experiences, how you choose to speak, to act, to think, to continue moving forward, that has always been yours, completely and without exception. When you stop directing energy toward outcomes you cannot govern, something becomes available that wasn't accessible before. A genuine surplus of attention and effort for the one thing always within reach. Your own chosen response to whatever is directly in front of you. This is not passive acceptance. It is not watching events unfold while folding your hands and calling it philosophical. It means bringing everything you have to the areas where your action genuinely matters and releasing the compulsion to control results in areas where the outcome was never yours to determine. When you release the grip on what you were never meant to hold, something opens. Resentment begins to ease, because resentment almost always lives in the gap between what you expected to control and what actually happened. Anxiety quiets, because so much of it was generated by the labor of managing eventualities that were always beyond your reach. Clarity arrives, because your attention is no longer fractured across 100 variables you cannot meaningfully affect. You are not powerless. You have never been powerless. You have simply been directing your power at targets that were always out of range. Circumstances will continue moving as circumstances move. People will make the choices they make. Life will bring what it brings, often without consulting your preferences. Your response, your considered, conscious, freely chosen response, is where your actual authority has always lived. The moment you claim full ownership of your response, the external world loses its hold over your internal state. Not because circumstances necessarily improve, they may or may not, but because you have stopped waiting for them to improve before allowing yourself to be at peace. You can move through chaos and remain ordered. You can stand inside disappointment and decide how to carry it. You can experience the loss of something you genuinely wanted and still choose who you intend to be in everything that follows. That is the shift the Stoics pointed toward across centuries. Not dominion over the world, but sovereignty over the self. And that is the shift that makes all the other differences possible. Mastery of your inner world does not arrive in a single defining breakthrough. It is not delivered by one profound realization or one particularly transformative evening of reflection. It comes the way rivers shape stone, through consistent, small, accumulating contact over time. The smallest choices are its point of origin. A pause where there was once an automatic reaction. A breath before words that used to depart without permission. A moment of observation where only impulse used to exist. These are not dramatic acts. They are the ones that actually build something lasting. You are not being asked to eliminate the human experience of difficult emotion. You are not being asked to become unreachable or to perform a version of strength that leaves no room for honesty. What you are being asked to do is develop the capacity to be with what arises, to feel it fully, to understand what it is pointing toward, and then to choose your response rather than simply discharge your reaction into the nearest available space. Fear will keep arriving, anger will still ignite, anxiety will continue pulling your attention toward futures that have not happened yet. The question is not whether these emotions will come, they will. The question is whether you are the one making the final decision about what happens next. Like Carl Jung's observation that the unconscious directs your life when you don't bring it into awareness is not only a psychological insight, it is a practical instruction for how to actually live. When you don't examine what operates beneath the surface of your reactions, you are effectively handing the controls to something you've never consciously chosen. You are running someone else's programming and calling it your nature. But the moment you begin to observe, to notice the pattern before it completes itself, to catch the fear before it makes the decision, to recognize the anger before it exits through your words, that moment is the beginning of something genuinely different. You will not be perfect at this. You will react when you intended to respond. You will let fear lead when you meant to move with courage. You will say the thing you later wished you hadn't, feel the weight of it, and have to begin again from that place. That beginning again is not failure, that is the practice itself. The practice does not have a destination you arrive at and remain in permanently. It is the ongoing act of returning, again and again, to the intention to meet your life consciously, rather than on autopilot. If you have been living inside a pattern that doesn't serve you, reacting from old fear, moving through anger you have never properly understood, bracing constantly against an anxious mind that will not settle, you do not have to dismantle it entirely today. You don't need to become an unrecognizable person by next week. What you need to do is make one different choice in one moment that actually matters to you. One pause instead of an explosion. One honest question instead of an immediate assumption. One, return to the present instead of 15 more minutes spent inside a worry that has already told you everything it knows. That single choice is not a small thing. It is the exact point where a different architecture begins to be constructed. As those choices accumulate over time, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. You begin to notice that the space between what triggers you and how you respond has grown a little wider. That anger doesn't carry you as far before you locate yourself again. That fear arrives and you still move. That anxiety speaks and you hear it. Choose not to follow its instructions and return to where you actually are. That is what inner mastery feels like. Not a life without turbulence, not the absence of difficulty, but a self that navigates the turbulence with increasing skill, increasing presence, increasing ownership of the one thing that has always genuinely belonged to you, your response to whatever comes. If this reached you today, do something with that. Don't allow this to remain a passing moment of inspiration that dissolves before you've reached the door. Take one thing, one specific concrete thing, and apply it in one specific situation this week. Let it be small. Small is precisely where it starts. And if you want to go deeper into this kind of work, into Stoic philosophy applied to the real challenges of being alive, hit that like button and return to Stoic site. There is more here for the version of you that refuses to remain exactly where you are. You are not your emotions. You are not your history. You are not the fear, the anger, or the anxiety that has narrated so much of your story until this moment. You are the awareness at the center of all of it, and that awareness has always carried the power to choose. Start there. Start now. One decision, one breath, one genuinely conscious moment. That is all it ever takes to begin.